Hello, everybody. Today is Thursday, December 5th. This is Dr. Jesinoski. This is the Wizard Podcast. I shaved off my beard. I feel like a young lad again. I feel kind of naked. So not very wizardly of me to not have a beard. But I got impulsive on Sunday. We were decorating the Christmas tree. I think there was a little bit too much conflation of my beard with Santa Claus. So maybe that's why I went for it. Maybe it was like a fresh start, a fresh beginning. Sometimes you shear the beard off and it feels like a fresh start. So Lucy and I just had ourselves a couple eggs. We got some coffee, having a nice morning. I got up and painted for a little while this morning, did a little reading, and I'm going to get back to painting as soon as I'm done here. So I just wanted to check in and share what's been on my mind, share kind of maybe some insight that has been happening in my life, and you know, sharing some of my recent experiences that maybe create that insight. I did want to say, I noticed I'm starting to get some emails, and I really appreciate everybody that has reached out and just been really thoughtful and supportive. And none of you had to do that, but you did, and that was really, really wonderful. So that lets me know that sharing in this way allows you to feel like you can connect and you want to connect. And along those lines, if anyone listens to any episode and they have questions or they want to explore something further, or you want to challenge me on something, I know sometimes things come out of my mouth, and it would be okay to talk about those things and debate about those things, or just have a good dialogue, a good discussion. So if anyone ever does have any questions or anything you want to explore further, or you know, maybe something's going on in your life and maybe you want to anonymously explore that a little bit further, so I'd be happy to do that. The best way to reach me is to email me at mark, M-A-R-K, at jesart.com, Jesart.com. So that is the email for my art business. So where's my mind been recently? I notice I've been working more with a lot of people recently who, you know, sometimes people come in and they present with some more acute symptoms or issues that they need support or help kind of walking through, you know, going through a stage of life situation, going through things that we go through, and they come and they go, but they're not long-term chronic things. They're not sources of long-term chronic pain or trauma. But I notice, and I suppose, you know, I'm more acutely aware of this because of my own experiences, and like I've said before, I don't mean to make my experiences more than they are. In the context of my life, it's been an immense opportunity to learn and grow. And I think when you go through deep pain, you kind of come to a crossroads. You can start to try to cover it up and push it away and distance yourself from it through all sorts of, you know, squashing our thoughts, ignoring our emotions, imagining emotions don't matter, which ironically is an emotional response. You know, using substances, arguing with people, externalizing our emotions, distancing ourselves from what we feel. So I've just been working with a lot of people recently that have had this real experience of, I would say, chronic trauma in their life. And just reflecting on my own experiences, you know, coming to a crossroad and thinking, okay, I can start running away. I can keep running away from this, or I can keep acting this out. I can keep acting out my emotions. I can keep trying to correct my reality and align it with the way I think the world should be, rather than adapting myself to a new reality. So you come to all these crossroads, and anybody that's ever been through a painful experience, which all of us have, anybody that ever has gone through a challenge that you just truly can't navigate or you don't know your way through, particularly if you've ever experienced things, and most of us have experienced things like this in childhood, because in childhood, you know, we are at the mercy of the choices of the adults around us. When children go through divorce, when children go through dramatic shifts and changes in parents' careers, for example, the kids don't get a choice. They have to come along for the ride. And the best way to do that is to be, real positive and supportive, and to have parents that can navigate those experiences gracefully, so that the children learn that change is okay, that adaptation is okay, that we don't always need to fight to keep things exactly the same, because that's not really very realistic. So I imagine all of you have been through experiences where you felt really confused or really lost or really powerless, that you simply could not change the experiences that you are in. You were powerless to other people's perspectives, other people's behavior, circumstances around you, cultural circumstances around you, even historical circumstances around you. You can expand outward and outward. But all of us can relate to what it feels like to have to either feel consumed by depression or consumed by anxiety, or to allow ourselves to get into a position of surrender, meaning fully surrendering to all that which we cannot change, that we cannot control. In fact, trying to control it makes it worse. Trying to control it creates an opposite energy, and we push others and they push us back. We oppose them, they oppose us back. We do this emotionally and energetically and with our thoughts. So, getting myself back on track. I was thinking this past week, how do I navigate these really... How do you help someone take an emotional story? That story we can all relate to. We have thoughts, we have emotions, we have sensations, and those things guide us through our day-to-day experiences. And how do you explain that? How do you define that? You notice I pause because I have to try to find the words to navigate through this, which is a big part of doing counseling and therapy. It's like, how do you attach the words to these really abstract experiences and these abstract concepts, which is all of our internal experience, but the nuances of thought, the nuances of emotion, the nuances of physical sensation, you almost have to get creative at times, almost poetic at times, I would say, and that's why I think art and poetry and music speaks to us so much. Art speaks to us. It helps us to understand and to navigate the abstractions and the unknowable, just like mythology helps us to navigate the abstractions and the unknowable. So we use art and mythology as a medium to empathize and to understand and to explore. So the real question, just to be a little more concrete, is how do we get started in that process? How, when I'm working with someone who has just been in a chronic state of powerlessness, or perceived powerlessness is the better way to put it, how do we start? How do we get going? I think the way we really work through that, and this is something I think that you all could do, this is something that I do really all the time through mindfulness practice, just by observing your body, observing your mind, observing and noticing without necessarily reacting or acting out what your mind and body is doing in the moment. So it's really, how do we see, how do we perceive the world from an emotional, a physical, a psychological, and even a spiritual perspective? How do we see the world? And how does the way that we see the world influence how we react and interact and actually influence the world around us? How do we influence our inner and outer world? By how we see it. And something I am just deeply fascinated by, something I'm learning by doing this podcast, is how differently everyone will respond to what I say, or the pieces that people will pull out and the pieces that people will attend to. I've gotten different messages from different people, and it's fascinating that the messages I get are really in alignment with the perspective of whoever is emailing me, which is obvious, but it also says a lot about how we selectively attend to the world around us because of the way we see it on a physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual level or plane or lens. So really, how do we start that story? How do we unravel a deep trauma story? What's really fascinating, what you learn by working with people with a lot of trauma, and what I've learned by working with myself, by really going within and observing what's happening in here and not necessarily acting it out, but coming to peace with it, using it as a source of data, using it as a source of information to help guide me on this path or in selecting my path, rather than seeing it as a nuisance that needs to go away. Remember, we live in a culture that has commodified our emotions, has commodified our pain, and the message is those things are nuisances or forms of disorders that need to go away. And the way I tend to look at this is our emotions are sources of data. Our sensations in our body are forms of data. They're forms of information. They help us understand how we see and perceive the world on an emotional, physical, psychological, and spiritual level. So if you can learn to listen to these sensations, listen to where your mind is going automatically, listen to how you automatically react to someone when they walk in the room or when they open their mouth or when they say something that's not quite in alignment with how you see the world or how you perceive the world. Think of how automatically we respond when someone says something from the other side that we don't agree with or we don't understand or we've never experienced. So how are we telling our story? And how is the way that we tell our story influencing how we perpetuate our story, how we actually create our story, how we create our reality, how we influence the world around us? So to unravel that story, you really have to go back to the beginning. Because speaking in a very sort of pragmatic, concrete way, we're built from the inside out. We're built neurologically. We're built chemically. We're built on a, atomic, cellular, physical level. It all comes together to create this thing. And there's a lot of reductionists out there that want to look at individual parts of the brain and individual parts of the body, and that's good to understand them and see how they work and see what their job is. But then you have to look at how all these parts come together to create this beautiful creature that we are, this creature that's capable of creation. If you believe we're created in the image of God, whether you believe that literally or mythologically, well, God is a creator. The divine is a creator. So if you're in the image of God, you are a creator. But if you have free will, then what do you create? What do you choose to create? How you see the world dictates how you will choose to create on an automatic level. So we got to go back to the beginning. We got to go back to the beginning and see where this story began. See how we started to build ourselves. Sometimes going back to the beginning means you actually go back to genealogy. You actually go back to the family tree and you look at trauma. You look at the trauma of, your parents and your grandparents, and you look at your ancestral history and you start to see, where did you come from? Where did your lineage come from? What did they experience? You start to look at your cultural paradigm leading up to when you were born, just, what was happening. When I was born in 1976, so, look at what happened. Vietnam War happened shortly before I was born. The Korean War prior to that, and World War II before that. And, we mention war because it's such a big, influential sort of landmark in time that really influences and shapes the world. Step back from that, it's look at how the various traumas influenced by war. This is why I got into this whole thing many years ago, both artistically and psychologically. But look at how war influences history by really through the trauma, but also through the healing and through the meaning we make through war. It's not just the pain, it's actually the meaning and the lessons we have to relearn over and over and over again, like all the shit that's going on right now in our culture. I mean, there's many books written about this stuff. This has happened before. This is nothing new. But it is happening, and you should be paying attention to it. And if you're pushing it away, then what you're trying to do is really warp this new reality around the way you think the world should be. And that, it's not going to work. You can try to force it, but it's not going to work. The world's going to move on. The world, the momentum is going to go, and sometimes we got to roll with that momentum. Doesn't mean you don't have values, and if anything, that's why I'm such a big advocate for values and ethics, and having a sense of what is guiding us through this process. Do we want to be guided by anger? Do we want to be guided by pain? Do we want to be guided by fear? Or do we want to be guided by love? Do we want to be guided by values? Do we want to be inspired to create? It goes back to, what do you want to create? Do you want to create anger? Do you want to create love? Do you want to create fear? Do you want to create freedom? So we go back to the lineage, we go back to the history, and then, and why? Because that influenced our parents, and it influenced our grandparents, and it influenced the way our culture was built. It influenced everything about the world that we were born into. We don't often think about this, but think of the world that you were born into. And that could have been many different ways. It was the way it was when you were born, and you were deeply influenced by that. So sometimes that story begins with a look into the family history. And then you look at, the circumstances you're born into. And it's really interesting to me. How does the human story begin? In other words, how does the story of memory begin? And I noticed recently I've been really boiling down a lot of things, explaining anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, obsessive compulsive disorder, all of these things that we use labels to define how we interact, how we conflate the part of our brain that is looking for danger with the part of our brain that creates meaning and idea and beliefs, how we conflate these two. So we create danger out of ideas, we create danger out of perceptions and beliefs. So how do you start to map that story out? How do we start to tell that story? What's really interesting is we start that story on a physical level, on a sensational level. In other words, the story of memory. If you look at anxiety, depression, all those things from the story of memory, what you realize is we start to respond to the world in a certain way. As we respond to the world, those responses get more and more etched into our neurological pathways, into our networks. They get more etched into our mind and body. This is a whole body experience. We are etching pathways in the form of memory. So we form depressive memories, we form anxious memories, we form our emotional experiences informing our intellectual experience. We are conflating the emotional with the intellectual. We are creating perceptions of danger and fear and loss and helplessness out of ideas and beliefs. So we're wrapping these two around each other. So your memories, the story of your life, is essentially all the information that was available. First of all, we don't even know how the hell memories are really formed. We have ideas about this stuff, but it's not some filing cabinet in your brain. I've read stuff that I don't even understand about how memories are formed in three-dimensional geometric forms and patterns, and how these chemical patterns relate to one another, and how they're the building blocks of memory. It's unbelievable. It's so far beyond the scope of my understanding. And really, I think we're just getting into this as a human species, studying this kind of stuff. We just don't really know how we store these memories. But suffice it to say, how do I feel this? How do I know this? How can I speak about this? Because I've been looking at the stories of thousands of people over the years, both through literature and by working, directly with people and helping people through their stories and listening to people's stories and helping them understand their story and helping them to unravel that story. And, realizing that story is it's so complex because it involves the sensations in your body, the emotions that you are feeling, all the contextual stuff around you. That's why things around us can be triggering. Music can be triggering, smells can be triggering, images, anything that you have stored in memory can be triggering. That's kind of how we recall memories. We trigger them. They're instigated by things that we are prompted by in our environment. So when someone uses the word trigger, I realize that's become some kind of a stupid buzzword, but all that means is you're tapping into a network. You're tapping into a pre-existing network of memory. So this whole story, your experience of depression, my experience of depression, of anxiety, of pain, of sadness, of happiness, it's a memory story. We're constantly measuring this present moment against our memory. We're constantly interpreting this present moment in the context of our memory. And just like that, your body and your limbic brain has the ability to access almost everything you have ever stored in memory is accessible to that limbic brain that responds to keep you safe. It's why you can see a squiggly stick out of the corner of your eye and jump as if it's a snake. Because your brain and body knows that squiggly things in the wild are not safe. They're not good. It's probably pre-wired into us, and then we also learn that. But that applies to almost anything. It's why we can have a knee-jerk reaction, a physical response. How many times do we have physical emotional responses to something in the moment? We like, our heart flutters and our heart starts to beat, and we're like, what's wrong with me? What am I feeling? And it's just our brain is interpreting danger in the form of an idea or something you have attached yourself to. Something about this story that you have wrapped yourself around is being triggered, is being prompted, and your brain is reminding you about the past so that it can inform you about the present. Remember, it's reminding you about the past, however, in the context of everything you have ever learned. And everything we have ever learned is biased toward our own unique time and space. So we have to recognize that our stories I would never say that our stories are truly correct, because we all are experiencing life through similar mediums. We all have this emotional medium. We all have this psychological medium. Again, these are just words I'm attaching to phenomena that all work organically and naturally. These things work without me attaching words to them. But, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the psychological, they all come together to form these ways of seeing the world, these ways of perceiving the world. So we have to understand that these ways of perceiving are not necessarily correct or accurate. They are unique to us. In that way, we all have a unique voice. We all have a unique perspective. It'd be very interesting if we all could share our unique perspective and recognize that sort of the law of averages would dictate that all of us sharing our perspectives together might just come to some sort of consensus that makes sense. Push it too far in the extremes, and now we're all thinking in the extremes of, we're thinking in terms of the biased perspectives of individuals who are, you could use the term outliers, but thinking in extremes, which thinking in extremes is totally cool, as long as you're not saying my extreme is righter than yours. In fact, mine is correct and yours is wrong, and I'm willing to harm you to prove that point. I'm willing to harm you to protect my perspective. So coming back, we're all telling ourselves a story based on our memory, and that's informing how we respond in the present moment. And going back to, how do we start this story? How do we start this? Think about your children, if you have children, or think about when you were a child. Imagine when you were a baby, you don't have language. When someone pinches you, you can't say, "Ow, that hurts." You squeak, you cry, you react. Your physical body reacts. Part of that physical body has the ability to make sounds, and you make sounds, and you hear those sounds, and other people hear those sounds, and they start responding to those sounds, and they start responding to your behavior. And how those people around you respond to the sounds and the behaviors that they're experiencing is how you start to tell your story. And you start that story on a sensational, emotional level because you don't have words to attach to it. You don't have symbols that create language, that create abstract concepts that can start to sort of formulate ideas about these things we're experiencing. Kierkegaard said, if you name me, you negate me, meaning we got to be careful about how we attach labels to things, because how we attach labels to things and how we all agree upon those labels, the language that we use, that really dictates a lot of times how we see the world. So we start to squeak and squawk and squiggle as little babies, and then we attach, different sounds and different words, and we especially attach the memories of the behavior of the people around us. I would say a lot of our memory is really, because our memory is through our eyes, it's through our ears, it's through our skin, it's through our body, it's through our heart. Our memory is collecting all this information, and we're telling this story to ourselves. If people are really mean to you, imagine you're a baby and everyone is everyone around you, your parents, your caretakers, are neglecting you. They're beating you, they're hurting you, they're not feeding you, they're yelling at you, they're screaming at you. Man, this happens way too much. Unfortunately, I have too much of a lens into that world. That's part of what I see and hear every day. And I really, a lot of people wonder, how do you work in that environment? You have to be really accepting of the way things are. In some ways, that's what's gotten me through my challenges, to be very, very accepting of things as they are. And then behaving, and then moving in the direction you can. So, people think that babies don't remember. It's one of the worst dumb ideas that we have, that babies don't remember. We can do dumb stuff around children because they won't remember. They will remember. They have memory. The memory is in the form of sensations in the body. It's in the form of emotions. It's in the form of pictures and images, and that all comes together to influence how we see the caregivers and the authority figures and the gods and goddesses in our lives. And that's real. That's true. As little children, the first people you have in your life, your caregivers, whoever they may be, are going to formulate deep ideas about how you see love and power and fear and control and freedom and all these things. Carl Jung would say that these become archetypes that help us to understand the world, that form the perception of the way we see the world. We think of this as being in the unconscious, which just means it's not accessible to us. Carl Jung looked at it as the shadow. Freud talked about it as the id, or the superego, or simply the unconscious. Whatever, it's just memory. It's memory. That's what it is. It's memory. It is memory that influences our perception, and that story started when we were little babies. Started with sensations, and it started with emotions, and it started with pictures and proximities, and we started forming a story, and then that story attached sounds to it, and it attached more complex things like language. We started attaching words. This is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. Ouch, that hurts. Mommy scared me, daddy scared me. These are things I hear, right? What stories are we telling ourselves from that early age? And then what really starts happening is the way that we start telling that story influences the way that we see the world. So suddenly we start seeing the world through very unique lenses. And anybody that's been a parent, or anybody that's, a developmental psychologist or something, you can see how the way that we see the world dramatically shifts in these developmental years. And all of a sudden, my oldest daughter, is 6. And all of a sudden, she's this little person. She's this little individual. For me, from 4 to 6, it's such a dramatic shift. But this year, all of a sudden, wow, she's her own person. I talk to her. We have conversations. She has her own ideas. She has her own thoughts. She has her own questions. It is just a beautiful thing. So the way we see the world starts to influence how we selectively attend to the world. Now imagine if you were treated in a way that you couldn't trust anybody. People didn't meet your emotional needs. They didn't meet your heart needs. They didn't meet your love needs. They didn't meet your food needs. They didn't meet your security needs. So you feel insecure in your body and you feel afraid in your body. You start to wrap your story around that fear and insecurity, and that story perpetuates itself. We could go into the nuances of, young, childhood, 6 to 10 or 6 to 12, and then adolescence, that story starts to get really unique and really narcissistic for a while. We start to form our own perspective of the way the world is, and we start to think we're correct about that perspective. Rather than adults telling us the way that we see the world, now we're starting to tell them the way we see the world, and we start standing our ground and we start getting firm. Some people learn to adapt. Some people learn to continue to learn and grow, and they take information in, and they recognize that you have to continue to adapt your story. You have to continue to develop your perception, because your perception is unique and biased, and it's not correct. I believe there is a thing as correct knowledge. It's a concept, correct knowledge. But that's a refined process. So we become adults, and we have been telling ourselves this story now, and this story is such a, multi-layered sandwich of emotions and sensations and images and pictures and people and ideas and archetypes and complexities, man. And what's crazy is every moment of your life, every moment of my life, every time, all the time, when you're experiencing something, you are experiencing that moment through the lens of everything you've ever learned, through your memory. I shouldn't say everything you've ever learned, through your memory. So that whatever your mind and body has attached itself to in the form of memory is going to dramatically influence how you immediately react to your environment, because it's so deeply entrenched in the limbic brain. In fact, we believe the hippocampus, which is in the limbic brain, is very important for long-term memory formation. So kind of interesting that the danger part of our brain is right next to the memory part of our brain. We remember stuff like that. The reward centers of our brain, very close to the memory centers. So we remember these things in the moment, and it helps us respond. Now the key, I would say, to, wisdom, enlightenment, growth, correct knowledge, is, can you know that all the reactions and responses in the moment are forms of data? They are wisdom. You should listen to them. You should observe them. And you should understand that they're not always correct. The way you respond to that person that you just run into, or the way you respond to what you hear, the way you respond to what you see, what you experience, is constantly filtered through these lenses. So the first step is, can you notice and observe that there is a difference between your consciousness, your soul, your observing self, your witness self, and all the sensations and ideas and perspectives that you're experiencing in the moment? Can you take a step back and can you take a look at it and recognize that the way you're reacting from your hip, from this automatic response, may not be correct? And can you look at that as data? This is where you have to start separating yourself from your ego. It's where you have to be able to start taking a step back and recognizing that this thing we call the ego is actually our collective memory acting out in the moment. And we're trying to act from that place, and this thing is trying to take over and it's trying to take control. It will actually fight for survival. We think that's who we are. We are so deeply and intimately attached to this perspective of the way we think we are. And that can be great. Your identity is important. Your identity is a very, very important thing. But recognizing we can refine that identity and understanding that we've been telling ourselves this story, and this story is biased based on all of our memory, and we need to be able to take a step back, take a look at it, observe it, notice it, feel it, and then to recognize that we can really start to open up. And what would it be like? This is kind of taking a jump forward, but what would it be like to see the present moment without judgment, without reaction, without fear? to see it simply for what it is in the moment, to go back to a child's mind, to go back to when you were that little child and you were experiencing the world through sensations and you didn't have words to define what you're experiencing. This is the deconstruction of the mind as an adult. This is really, to me, what, counseling, therapy, healing, it's about not tearing it apart to be judgmental. No, it's being observant of it. It's being ultra accepting of it for what it is without judgment. Using it as a form of information, but recognizing you are more than your memory. You are more than your ego. You're more than your identity. You're more than who you think you are. You're more expansive than that. You're more capable than that. You have way more going on than that. So can you learn to take a step back? Can you learn to observe what you're thinking and feeling? Can you actually look at the information coming into you? Any perspective someone gives you is a form of information. They're giving you their emotional information. They're giving you their intellectual information. And they're giving you their ideas. So, we're all these bouncing buoys in this ocean of life, and we're bouncing up against each other, and we could be looking at each other as forms of information, as sources of wisdom. We could be observing each other and listening to each other. This is what deep empathy is about. Can I really understand what it's like to be in your shoes, to see the world through your eyes, and to allow that to influence maybe how I interact with you? Doesn't mean I need to fully change who I am. In fact, the more refined I get, the more strong my identity is. The more I know exactly where I will stand my ground, and the more I know where I will be flexible. 9 times out of 10 now, things that I would have argued about in the past, I just don't go there. I go in my mind and I try to settle the conflict in my mind, in my body, that is arising from automatic reactions and memory before I even have to act it out with someone else. I have to look in there and decide, is this a conflict within myself? Do I need to try to correct this on the outside? Do I need to stand my ground? Do I need to prove that I know to this person? Do I need to prove that I'm right? A lot of times, no. But when I really feel like I need to, then I will really stand my ground strongly. And I will only budge if necessary. But most of the time, it's all about being flexible and fluid. So that's really kind of taking a full circle journey today. How do you work through deep trauma, and really just how do you work through life? Because all of us are walking through life. All of us are telling ourselves a story. All of us have, trauma is just a word. All of us have stuff that has influenced us to see the world through the lens of anger or pain or sadness or fear or judgment. And all of us have had experiences that allow us to see the world through a sense of love and happiness and joy. Unfortunately, some people have experiences, that are full of pain and that are full of negativity. As a little sidebar, I was listening to this hardcore history I listen to sometimes. Dan Carlin, I believe his name is. And it was listening about, he was talking about war, the history of war, but he was talking particularly about Imperial Japan invading China pre-World War II and just the slaughter that took place. And he was talking in there about how the men that came from Japan to China, how they were treated back in Japan. And it just occurred to me, I was really trying to get inside the eyes of someone that would commit acts of, horrible atrocities in war, or, the raping and the pillaging, the real bad shit. Because it's easy to be sanctimonious. It's easy to be like, well, I could never do that, and I would never do that. That's the danger of Nazi Germany. Those are the lessons we've learned. Don't assume, don't say, what a good boy am I, and suddenly, you're doing really dumb shit because you've been so unconscious your whole life. You don't recognize that you're susceptible to the influence of powerful ideas and powerful people, and you're kind of a sheep, and maybe you're walking with the herd, the flock, whatever. So I was thinking about how those kinds of things take place and looking throughout history. What would lead people to behave in a way that just looks horrendous, that looks horrible, that is the worst stuff you could imagine? And you realize, and I've learned this a lot, by going into my own darkness and my own pain and really coming to terms with it. It's part of why I've kind of isolated myself the last couple years. The inclination is to reach out for help, and every time I got on my phone and I thought about texting someone or calling someone, I asked myself, what was I seeking? And it's always seeking support, I want someone to buttress me up and make me feel safe and let me bounce my perspective off them and let me know that I'm safe and okay. Well, I decided to start working on doing that for myself, and to listen to myself and listen to my emotions and to listen to my fear. And rather than try to quench that fear, rather than run away, or rather than try to reach out and have someone rescue me, to sit with that fear and observe it and to really look at it and just, what are you telling me? So you realize when people grow up in horrible circumstances where they don't get their needs met and there is no love, there is no nurturing, there is no support, born into horrible circumstances, they start telling themselves a pretty rough story early on. So from right away, they're neglected, they're injured, they're hurt, and they start to tell themselves that story on a physical, emotional level, and then that turns into ideas, it turns into archetypes, it turns into gods and goddesses. Suddenly, we're telling ourselves a very dark story, and that's turning into ideas. We've had whole eras like this throughout human history where people are born injured, their parents were injured, their grandparents were injured, the culture around them is injured. They start to tell this really dark story. I'm afraid that's happening in our culture now, and you really pan back and look at this from a much broader perspective. We're starting, actually I'm quite an optimist. Just to clarify, there's a lot of people out there telling themselves a very dark story. Everyone's out to get us. Everyone's trying to take something from us. Everyone's trying to invade us. Man, this defensive, dark story. And people in power use that fear. They sniff it out and they use that fear for power. That's how we got into the situation we're in. There are people out there who sniff out fear and bias, and they use that and they manipulate that and they use it for power. Works really, really well. It's always worked really well. Unfortunately, it nurtures darkness. It nurtures more injury. It really nurtures division. So the optimist in me sees people across this land learning mindfulness. People learning yoga. And please don't conflate those ideas with the left or, well, I wouldn't even have to say the right, but, these are just practices. These are just things. These are just things we do. And anybody can learn mindfulness. Anybody can learn how to observe their mind and body. Anybody can learn to do physical practices that will allow them to release negative emotions stored in the body. Anybody can explore something new. I think a lot of times, and it's a left thing, it's a right thing, and I don't even mean to look at it through that lens. It's just what I'm thinking in this moment. But a lot of times, people will just defend things from the hip, and they'll start fighting for it, and they'll assume that a certain idea is from a perspective that they don't want to buy into. So rather than considering the possibility that their mind is not correct, that they could learn something from someone else or some other idea, they push it away before even learning it. I don't even see that. I don't even want to see that climate change report. That's just ridiculous. Stupid, man. So take in information. Be willing to take in information. Be willing to be a curious traveler in your life. Be willing to observe your mind and body. Be willing to observe what's going on around you. Be willing to use that as information. Really refine yourself. Learn what is most important to you. What are your core values? Not what are your core biases, not what are your core fears, not what are your core injuries. What are your core values? Usually values have some pretty positive stuff attached to them. And values also denote ethics. So people all of a sudden have a code that they live by. Wouldn't it be nice if people started living by ethics again? Holy shit. Get some ethics, man. So, I could ramble on. It's been really nice talking to you all today. Kind of went full circle in how do we unravel this story of our life and learn to use our pain and our wisdom and our pain and our emotions and our memories as a source of wisdom so that we can learn to be more adept navigators of this world around us. I'm sure I went off on a few tangents today that I didn't close up. That was a lot of information and a lot of different things to weave together to kind of tell that story. And again, if any of you have any questions, if any of you are, curious about different parts of this, please email me, Mark, M-A-R-K, @jesart, JESART.com. This is Dr. Mark Jesinoski. This is the Wizard Podcast, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care.